Good afternoon, everyone. I thought I'll just give you a brief account of my briefing to the Security Council on the human rights situation in Syria as of this moment. The current situation is where hundreds remain trapped in Deir ez-Zor and the old city of Homs due to increasing use of heavy weapons and continuing armed clashes. And OHCHR and the Independent Commission of Inquiry in Syria have documented serious human rights violations by both the government and opposition forces. What are the violations on the part of government forces? Well, indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, targeted killings of activists and opposition supporters, arbitrary detentions, torture and rape, as well as attacks on hospitals and clinics and using health facilities for military operations. The violations on the part of opposition forces include killings of suspected government informers and perceived collaborators. The increasing use of improvised explosive devices causing civilian deaths and injuries. And we have credible reports that indicate that armed groups have also taken over at least one medical facility for military purposes. I spoke to the Security Council about the need for accountability for these human rights violations. In my view, both government forces and armed opponents have been involved in actions harming civilians. Those responsible for attacks against civilians must be held accountable. And so I reiterated my call on the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, as I believe that the evidence points to the commission of crimes against humanity. The government of Syria attributes these violations to terrorists. The government should grant independent investigators access to the country to verify this information, and I stand ready to send my staff in there to investigate this allegation on the part of the government. There is a risk of escalation. The provision of arms to the Syrian government and to its opponents is fueling the violence. Any further militarization of the conflict must be avoided at all costs. With regard to protection issue, UNSMIS's presence in the country remains vital. I urge the Security Council to support and strengthen UNSMIS's mandate to enable it to effectively monitor and report on the human rights situation in Syria. Ending the conflict is what we all seek. Any solution to the conflict must adequately address the root causes of the conflict, namely the human rights grievances. I welcome the Action Group's plan and hope that it will rapidly pave the way for a genuinely democratic and inclusive state with full respect for human rights and the rule of law. Thank you.
The Hula investigation, I know this may take us back a few weeks, but there was a very high-profile Security Council meeting talking about investigating a very specific attack, a killing of slightly more than 100 people. What's been your office's role in that, and where the report, at least I understand, hasn't been given to the Security Council yet? Who is responsible for those killings? And also, does your renewal for 2 rather than 4 years, do you feel it has any impact on your ability to speak independently on this issue and on the other ones you'll be briefing on, including Palestine?
I'll just take the Syria question. The Commission of Inquiry was specifically mandated by the Human Rights Council to investigate the incident at El Hula, where 100 people, men, women, and children were killed, and that statistics accords with our own independent research. The Commission of Inquiry reported to the Human Rights Council on Friday, and in their view, they were unable to determine who exactly the perpetrators are, but they set out various evidence which points to the greater responsibility of the government.
Okay. The situation in Homs, I understand that tens of thousands of Christians have been trapped or evicted from Homs. Can you elaborate on the situation there? And have you been successful in any way in trying to spot who's culprit behind these the plight of especially the Christian community in that town?
Now, I can't comment on that specific statistic, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people were forced to flee their homes, and they are largely civilians, possibly from the various minority groups who are being attacked by the government forces, but civilians are also caught in this crossfire and violence between the government forces and opposition forces.
Not used as human shield or taken as hostages, are they?
There is a report that children have been used as human shields, but by the anti-government forces.
Pilay,
Thank you.
you mentioned that you're referring the situation what happened in Syria to the International Criminal Court. Will this, if through their investigation, because they will start an investigation, can they start actually an investigation through your, just from you referring this, but especially if they do this, if they start in this, and happen that they will can prove that the government is involved in those human rights violations. At that point, any solution that they practically will leave Bashar al-Assad in power or in the government, would you consider it impossible at that point, that solution?
Because I'm the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I report on human rights violations and call for accountability. Accountability means that I come to the Security Council and urge them to refer the situation in Syria, because I believe that serious crimes are being committed there. It's true that it's a political decision, but the Security Council has in the past courageously taken the decision to make these referrals, and even before the ICC, they set up 2 tribunals in respect of former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, simply because the United Nations is a norm-based organization. It is against impunity for serious crimes. But as I said, it's a political decision of the Security Council. Thank you.
This has reached.
I'll take that question.
Thank you, Madam Pilay. If I understood okay, you said you asked to the Security Council for strengthening the UN mission in Syria. Is that right? To strengthen the UN mission in Syria?
Yes,
and
that's
if it's,
right.
Can you detail more in which way? Because the mandate is going to expire July 20th. And it's about, bring more blue helmets, more civilians, civil staff. What do you ask for?
I was asked many questions by the members of the Security Council on the role of UNSMIS, and I explained, for instance, how closely we work in monitoring human rights violations. That's my office, the Commission of Inquiry, and UNSMIS. It's very, very important that they are on the ground monitoring the situation, and that's when action can be taken for protection of civilians. So I've urged a strengthening of UNSMIS, and that they should be empowered. The Security Council should instruct the Syrian government, the authorities, to let UNSMIS carry out its work safely in Syria.
How
Thank you.
the conflict to be a sectarian or civil war?
That's what.
Yeah.
I have hesitated for a very long time in characterizing this struggle. As we all know, it started off as a struggle of people for their legitimate human rights and dignity, but the character of the struggle has changed completely now, and I'm now calling it an internal armed conflict, because all the criteria, the intensity of the hostilities, the involvement of armed opposition groups, and all the statistics we've come up with makes this a situation that falls squarely under the characterization of international armed conflict, and therefore international humanitarian law and international human rights law then comes into play. The obligation on the part of the government, its responsibility to protect civilians, comes into play. And this is the basis also on which I am urging a referral of the situation to the International Criminal Court. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you.
Bonjour. I'll